And we are Team Baygull from Newton North High School, and this is our project, HDI and GDP, the perfect pair. No country, however rich, can afford the waste of its human resources. Demoralization caused by vast unemployment is the greatest menace to our social order, said by former President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1934. This quote highlights the risks and dangers once faced by Americans during the Great Depression. The implications of recessions will be expanded upon by my teammate Alan. The hope to prevent such disaster from happening again forms the basis of our problem statement. However, before we begin, I would like to introduce the two key concepts that help to shape our project. One, a negative growth of at least 2% in the gross domestic product, or GDP, is considered a recession. And two, the positive correlation between GDP and the Human Development Index, or HDI, is growing stronger as time goes on. Thus, combining all of the known information, we ended up with a problem statement of how do we prevent recessions through efficiently maintaining a GDP growth greater than negative 2% annually by controlling the value of HDI.
For our data methodology, we used mainly 4 international sources: Our World in Data, the United Nations Statistics Division, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and the United Nations Department of Statistics. The fact that these sources were international is extremely important, since they allowed us to compare countries side by side. These sources include data on all of these variables, and many more, all on a per year, per country basis. The scope and variety of this data was very important for us to, it allowed us to make correlations between all of these variables in GDP and HDI. In terms of reliability, we found that since this data was collected by the UN, is internationally renowned, and is trusted by governments around the globe, used in their economies and in economic predictions, we found that our data was extremely reliable and have complete confidence in its credibility.
Now, let's talk about mathematical methodology for our project and its outcomes. The goal of our project is to control GDP through HDI's influence. Thus, we needed to find a correlation that would allow us to predict a concrete value of GDP when HDI is changed respectively. This is the exponential regression graph we use and the correlation that we found. Now that we have this reliable pattern, our sole focus is raising HDI, and our set value of GDP will follow. We used a type of machine learning called a light gradient boosting model for this task of finding how to raise HDI. We trained it using the large data set from the UN and reliably predicted the variables yielding the biggest impact on HDI. These variables are the Gender Inequality Index, the Gross National Income, and the mean years of school. Now that we have our list of variables to increase HDI and GDP, we use regression models to infer what type of policies would raise these components, therefore setting the network of outcomes in motion. It determined, all with strong correlations, the following facts. Firstly, passing gender budgeting legislation will decrease gender inequality, which will increase Human Development Index and increase gross domestic product. Secondly, increasing foreign investments will increase gross national income, which will increase HDI and increase GDP. Finally, increasing government expenditure on education will increase the mean years of schooling, which will increase the Human Development Index, and finally increase gross domestic product. In order to reduce redundancy in our model, our recommendations will not focus on gross national income due to its proximity to our target variable of GDP. The strong correlations found with the other variables, are strong and will still allow us to increase HDI and GDP and the quality of life for all.
All right, now we're going to talk about the risk analysis, which is personally my favorite part. So the main idea is that low GDP equals recession, as Gina already talked about. But what is a recession? Well, a recession is just a decline in the economy. Next, we're going to look at the frequency of recession. From this graph, we can see the recessions from the past. Some of the well-known ones are COVID, 2008 recession, and the 9/11 attacks. On average, there's a recession every 6.5 years, so that is pretty frequent. Some of the bad things that can happen when a recession happens is business failure, stock market crash, lower income, and fewer jobs. Now we have a graph here with the red line being HDI to GDP and the blue line being the derivative of the red line. And through our analysis, we found that a 0.01 change in HDI will result in a 1.07% change in GDP. So according to the International Monetary Fund, a recession is around 2% to 5% decline in GDP. And so that means if we have a 0.02 decrease in HDI, that will lead to a recession. So the most important variable that contributes to HDI is the GII, or Gender Inequality Index. And it is a composite measure made up of three areas: reproductive health, empowerment, and labor market. So the less GII, then men and women are more equal in these areas. But the more GII, men and women are not so equal in these areas. So here's our graph of GII rank versus HDI 2021, and we can see a strong negative correlation between these two variables. The second most important factor to HDI is education. From both of these graphs, we can see that increasing education does increase HDI, but until a certain point where funding education too much is not beneficial to HDI anymore. And now we're going to talk about our expected value. And you can see a giant question mark on the screen here. And it is because there are just so many variables that can affect HDI. We are unable to provide a probability of whether the HDI is going to go up in the future or go down. And if we don't have a probability, then it is impossible for us to calculate our expected value.
All right, now let's talk about our recommendations. We created 2 recommendations based on the factors that are the most influential on HDI, which we obtained from our machine learning, as we just talked about. Our recommendations theoretically can be applied to all countries, since our data came from international sources and thus predicts global trends. However, they do not take into consideration the challenges each individual country is facing right now, as there is both a data and time obstacle. So instead, they will be geared towards the US, and it will be assumed that 1, the government has adequate finances, and 2, they will be able to pull money from other subjects to put into the ones we will be discussing today without severe consequences. One of the variables which showed a strong correlation with the HDI is the Gender Inequality Index. As we said earlier, a way to raise the HDI is to lower the GII. A UN's dataset in 2021 showed that the US only ranked 44th out of 170 places for the low value of this measure. So clearly we have room for improvement. Now, what can they do? A potential solution is to adopt gender-responsive budgeting, which is a policy of creating budgets that take the challenges each gender faces into consideration. Over 100 countries have already made efforts to implement this policy, and many have already seen significant progress. Sadly, the US isn't one of them. The layout of this policy is already detailed in a set of recommendations from the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Another variable which demonstrated a strong impact on HDI is the mean years of schooling of a country. And a way to raise this is to raise how much the government spends on it. As the pie chart shows, in 2020, The US only spent 5.4% of their GDP on education. But how much should they raise their education budget by? Underspend and the desired effect may not be achieved. Overspend and the government risks taking necessary funds away from other critical departments. To answer this, we modeled how much the government spends on education as a percentage of GDP against the mean years of schooling and HDI of the country, as you see up there. Both graphs peak at about 8%, which indicates that a government expenditure of 8% of their GDP can yield the highest return. Additionally, we found that by hitting this goal, the US can have as much as a net gain of 2%, which translates to roughly $300 billion. And with this, we conclude our presentation. Now we are open to questions. Thank you.